When people think about the greatest empires in history, they usually imagine giant kingdoms with massive populations and endless armies. They think about Rome, the British Empire, the Mongols, or perhaps Spain. Very few people stop and think about Portugal, a country so small that on a modern map, it can almost disappear beside its larger neighbor Spain. But for centuries, this tiny kingdom sitting on the far western edge of Europe controlled trade routes, colonies, and strategic ports stretching across 4 continents. Portuguese ships sailed farther than any Europeans had ever sailed before. Portuguese merchants traded in cities that most Europeans had never even heard of. Portuguese soldiers and missionaries appeared in Africa, India, China, Japan, and Brazil long before most European powers even understood how large the world truly was. And somehow, all of this began with a fragile little kingdom fighting for survival on the Iberian Peninsula. The story starts in a violent and divided medieval world. In the early 12th century, the Iberian Peninsula was not divided into the modern nations we recognize today. Large portions of the south were controlled by Muslim kingdoms that had ruled parts of Iberia for centuries, while Christian kingdoms in the north constantly fought one another while also pushing southward in a long conflict known as the Reconquista. It was a world of castles, shifting alliances, crusading knights, and ambitious rulers trying to carve out power wherever they could. What would later become Portugal was originally just a border territory, the county of Portugal, located in the western part of the Kingdom of Leon. It was not independent. It was not powerful. And nobody at the time could have imagined that this small frontier region would one day command a global empire. But one man changed everything. His name was Afonso Henriques. Born around the year 1109, Afonso grew up in a world filled with political tension and noble rivalries. His father, Count Henry of Burgundy, had governed the county of Portugal under the authority of Leon. But after Henry's death, power increasingly fell into the hands of Afonso's mother, Teresa. Over time, Teresa developed close political ties with Galician nobles, and many Portuguese nobles feared that the county would lose its independence and simply become absorbed into neighboring territories. Afonso refused to let that happen. As a young nobleman, he gathered supporters among Portuguese knights and local elites who wanted autonomy. Then, in one of the most dramatic moments in Portuguese history, he openly rebelled against his own mother. In 1128, at the Battle of Salmamed, Afonso's forces defeated Teresa's supporters, effectively placing him in control of the county. It was a shocking act for the time, but it established Afonso as the dominant political figure in the region. Still, controlling Portugal was not enough. Afonso wanted recognition. He wanted sovereignty. He wanted to create a kingdom. And to achieve that goal, he needed victories. The Iberian Peninsula at the time was consumed by the Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign by Christian kingdoms to reclaim territory from Muslim rulers. Warfare was constant. Castles changed hands repeatedly. Religious identity became deeply tied to political legitimacy. Afonso understood that military success against Muslim forces would strengthen both his authority and his claim to independence. According to Portuguese tradition, the defining moment came in 1139 at the Battle of Arique. The exact details remain debated by historians, but the battle became legendary in Portuguese memory. Afonso reportedly defeated a much larger Muslim force and afterward proclaimed himself king. Later stories claimed he experienced a divine vision before the battle, seeing a heavenly sign promising victory. Whether literal or symbolic, the story helped create the image of Portugal as a kingdom blessed by God itself. But declaring yourself king and actually being recognized as one were very different things. For decades, Afonso fought to secure legitimacy. He battled rival Christian rulers in the north while continuing campaigns against Muslim territories in the south. Castles were captured, borders shifted, treaties were negotiated and broken. Slowly, through military force and careful diplomacy, Portugal began to emerge as an independent political entity. One of Afonso's greatest achievements was gaining support from the Catholic Church. In medieval Europe, papal recognition carried enormous weight. A ruler acknowledged by the Pope gained religious legitimacy, which strengthened his position against rivals. Afonso presented Portugal not merely as another regional kingdom, but as a Christian bulwark fighting Islam during the Reconquista. It worked. In 1179, Pope Alexander III issued a papal bull officially recognizing Portugal as an independent kingdom and acknowledging Afonso as its rightful king. It was a historic moment. Portugal had become a sovereign nation, and unlike many European states whose borders constantly changed for centuries, Portugal's frontiers stabilized remarkably early. This gave the kingdom something incredibly valuable in medieval Europe: continuity. Geography also shaped Portugal's destiny in ways that would become increasingly important. To the east stood powerful Castile, a constant reminder that expansion by land would always be difficult and dangerous. But to the west lay the Atlantic Ocean, vast, mysterious, and mostly unexplored by Europeans. At first, the ocean was simply part of daily life. Fishing communities dotted the coast. Sailors traveled short distances for trade. But gradually, something changed in the Portuguese mindset. While many European kingdoms focused inward on continental wars, Portugal began developing a relationship with the sea. The Atlantic was no longer just a boundary. It was becoming an opportunity. Throughout the 12th and 13th centuries, Portuguese rulers continued pushing southward against Muslim territories. Castles rose across newly conquered lands. Christian settlers moved into captured regions. By 1249, under King Afonso III, Portuguese forces completed the conquest of the Algarve, securing the southern coastline and effectively creating the territorial shape of modern Portugal. That achievement mattered enormously. For the first time, Portugal no longer needed to focus entirely on survival or territorial consolidation. The kingdom had secure borders, access to the Atlantic, and increasing political stability. While other European states remained trapped in endless border conflicts, Portugal could begin looking outward. The country itself, however, was still modest and underdeveloped by later imperial standards. Most people lived in rural villages. Agriculture dominated daily life. Noble families controlled vast estates, while the church possessed tremendous power and wealth. Medieval society remained deeply hierarchical, with peasants laboring beneath nobles and clergy. Yet change was slowly coming. Cities such as Lisbon, Porto, and Coimbra began growing as centers of trade and administration. Merchants became increasingly important. Shipbuilders, sailors, and craftsmen found opportunities along the coast. Foreign traders visited Portuguese ports, bringing goods and ideas from across Europe and the Mediterranean. The kingdom was slowly transforming into a maritime society. One ruler who played an especially important role in this transformation was King Denis, who ruled from 1279 to 1325. Known as the Farmer King, Denis focused heavily on internal development. He encouraged agriculture, strengthened royal authority, reorganized administration, and promoted education. But he also understood the importance of the sea. Under his reign, Portugal invested more seriously in naval organization. Forests were protected and expanded to provide timber for shipbuilding. Ports developed further. Maritime activity increased. While Denis could never have imagined the global empire his kingdom would later build, he helped establish the foundations that made future expansion possible. At the same time, larger forces were reshaping Europe. Trade networks connecting Europe to Asia were growing increasingly important. Luxury goods, such as spices, silk, and precious stones, traveled westward through complex overland routes controlled largely by Muslim merchants and Mediterranean trading powers like Venice and Genoa. European demand for Eastern goods continued growing, but access remained expensive and politically complicated. Portugal sat far from these traditional trade centers, and that distance created frustration. The Portuguese knew wealth existed beyond Europe, but they lacked direct access to it. Overland trade routes passed through rival powers. Mediterranean commerce was dominated by stronger maritime states. Portugal needed another path, Even before the great age of exploration officially began, the idea was already forming. If land routes were blocked, perhaps the ocean offered another way. Religion also shaped this mentality. Medieval Portugal was intensely Catholic. The Reconquista had fused religious identity with political ambition. Fighting Muslim powers was viewed not only as warfare, but as sacred duty. This crusading spirit would later justify overseas expansion, allowing Portuguese rulers to frame exploration as both commercial opportunity and holy mission. But before Portugal could turn fully toward the sea, the kingdom faced one of the greatest crises in its history. In 1348, the Black Death arrived. Like much of Europe, Portugal suffered catastrophic losses. Entire villages disappeared. Fields were abandoned. Labor shortages disrupted agriculture and weakened the feudal system. Fear spread everywhere. Social tensions intensified as survivors struggled to rebuild shattered communities. Then came another disaster. In 1383, King Fernando I died without a male heir, creating a succession crisis that threatened Portugal's independence itself. Castile moved quickly to assert control through dynastic claims, and many feared Portugal would be absorbed into its larger neighbor. What followed was a national uprising. At the center of the resistance stood João, master of the Order of Avis, an illegitimate son of an earlier Portuguese king. João emerged as the leader of forces determined to preserve Portuguese independence. Merchants, urban populations, and many nobles rallied behind him, fearing domination by Castile. The crisis exploded into war. In 1385, Portuguese and Castilian armies met at the Battle of Aljubarrota. The battle became one of the defining moments in Portuguese history. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Portuguese forces used superior positioning, defensive tactics, and disciplined infantry formations to crush the Castilian army. The victory stunned Europe. Portugal had preserved its independence against overwhelming odds. João was crowned King João I, founding the Avis dynasty. That victory changed everything. It created political stability after years of uncertainty. It strengthened national identity. It reinforced the idea that Portugal was separate from Castile and destined to follow its own path. And perhaps most importantly, it allowed the kingdom to think beyond immediate survival. João I also strengthened ties with England through the Treaty of Windsor in 1386, creating one of the oldest diplomatic alliances in history. English military support and commercial connections would later benefit Portuguese trade and naval development in important ways. But the greatest consequence of the Avis dynasty was not diplomatic. It was generational. João I and his English queen, Philippa of Lancaster, raised a remarkable group of children later remembered in Portuguese history as the illustrious generation. These princes grew up in a court shaped by victory, ambition, religious conviction, and increasing curiosity about the wider world. One of those sons would become especially famous. Prince Henry. Born in 1394, Henry was not expected to inherit the throne. As a younger royal son, he pursued military, administrative, and religious responsibilities instead. But he possessed something unusual for his time, an intense fascination with geography, navigation, and the unknown regions beyond Europe. At the beginning of the 15th century, the world still seemed enormous and mysterious to Europeans. Much of Africa remained unmapped by them. Sea travel beyond familiar coastlines was considered extremely dangerous. Sailors feared storms, sea monsters, boiling waters near the equator, and endless oceans from which no ship could return. Henry looked at those fears differently. Where others saw danger, he saw possibility. And soon, Portugal would take its first major step beyond Europe. In 1415, Portuguese forces launched an expedition across the Strait of Gibraltar to attack the North African city of Ceuta. The conquest was symbolic as much as strategic. Ceuta sat at the crossroads of Mediterranean and African trade routes. Gold, spices, ivory, and enslaved people passed through its markets. Capturing the city offered Portugal both economic opportunity and religious prestige as part of the continuing crusading struggle against Muslim powers. Prince Henry participated personally in the campaign. The victory electrified Portugal. For the first time, the kingdom had expanded beyond Iberia itself. Ceuta became Portugal's first overseas possession, a small foothold that hinted at far greater ambitions to come. Yet the conquest also revealed limitations. Although Ceuta gave Portugal a strategic port, it did not provide direct access to the trans-Saharan trade routes the Portuguese hoped to control. Muslim merchants simply redirected commerce elsewhere. Henry understood something important from this disappointment. If Portugal wanted wealth and influence, it could not simply seize isolated cities. It needed to reach the sources of trade directly. And that meant sailing farther south along the African coast than any Europeans had dared before. From his base in southern Portugal, particularly around Sagres in the Algarve, Henry gathered navigators, map-makers, sailors, astronomers, and shipbuilders. Historians debate whether the famous school of Sagres truly existed as a formal institution, but there is no doubt that Henry sponsored a concentrated effort to improve maritime knowledge. At the same time, Portuguese ship design advanced rapidly. The caravels developed during this period were revolutionary. Smaller and more maneuverable than older ships, caravels could sail against the wind more effectively and survive longer ocean voyages. Combined with improved maps, magnetic compasses, and instruments like the astrolabe, Portuguese sailors gained abilities previous generations lacked. Still, exploration remained terrifying. Early voyages hugged coastlines cautiously. Crews feared sailing beyond familiar waters. Cape Bojador on the northwest African coast became especially infamous among European sailors. Legends claimed terrible currents and monsters waited beyond it. For years, nobody dared pass it. Then, in 1434, a Portuguese navigator named Gil Eanes finally succeeded in rounding the cape. The psychological impact was enormous. An invisible barrier had been broken. Suddenly, the Atlantic and African coastline no longer seemed impossible frontiers. Expedition after expedition pushed farther south. Portuguese ships reached new rivers, mapped unfamiliar coasts, and established contact with African societies previously unknown to Europeans. Gold arrived in Portugal. So did ivory, and increasingly enslaved human beings. This darker side of Portuguese expansion emerged almost immediately. By the 1440s, Portuguese traders and raiders were capturing or purchasing enslaved Africans and transporting them back to Lisbon. Public slave markets appeared in Portugal itself. What began as limited trafficking would eventually grow into one of the most devastating systems in human history. Prince Henry profited directly from these activities. For centuries, he was romanticized purely as a visionary explorer, but modern historians recognize the reality more clearly. Henry's motivations were mixed: religious ambition, desire for wealth, strategic competition against Muslim powers, scientific curiosity, and personal prestige all combined together. And under his sponsorship, Portugal became the first European kingdom to systematically explore and exploit the Atlantic world. At the same time, Portuguese sailors discovered and settled Atlantic islands, including Madeira and the Azores. These islands became experimental colonies where plantation agriculture developed using enslaved labor. Sugar production expanded rapidly, creating immense profits and establishing economic patterns later repeated on a much larger scale in Brazil and the Caribbean. The Atlantic islands also served another purpose. They became stepping stones, bases for navigation, training grounds for empire. By the time Prince Henry died in 1460, Portugal had not yet reached India. It had not rounded Africa. It had not created the massive empire that would later astonish the world. But the direction was set. The kingdom had turned permanently toward the sea. Portuguese sailors had begun mapping Africa. Trade networks were expanding. Maritime technology was advancing rapidly. And perhaps most importantly, Portugal had developed something rare in medieval Europe, a national obsession with exploration. The ocean was no longer the edge of the world. For Portugal, it was a road to power. By the second half of the 15th century, Portugal had become something unusual in Europe. It was still a small kingdom with a relatively tiny population, but it possessed an advantage no larger power could easily copy. For decades, Portuguese sailors had been gathering knowledge little by little, voyage after voyage, cape after cape, river after river. Each expedition returned with maps, observations, wind patterns, currents, and stories from distant coasts. While most European kingdoms remained focused on wars over land, dynastic struggles, and regional politics, Portugal was quietly building expertise in something far more revolutionary: long-distance ocean navigation. The process was slow, dangerous, and incredibly expensive. Ships disappeared without explanation. Sailors died from disease, storms, starvation, and shipwrecks. Some expeditions returned with almost nothing. Others came back carrying gold dust, ivory, spices, or enslaved captives. But the Portuguese crown kept investing because the potential reward was enormous. Every ruler in Lisbon understood the same basic reality. The wealth of Asia was changing Europe. Spices especially had become some of the most valuable commodities on earth. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and ginger were not merely luxuries. In medieval Europe, they preserved food, flavored meals, symbolized wealth, and played roles in medicine. Demand for them was enormous among Europe's elites. Yet every shipment that arrived in Europe passed through a long chain of middlemen. Indian merchants sold to Arab traders. Arab traders sold to merchants in the Middle East. Venetian and Genoese traders dominated Mediterranean distribution. By the time spices reached northern Europe, prices had multiplied many times over. Portugal wanted to bypass the entire system. If Portuguese ships could sail directly to India, the kingdom would gain access to unimaginable profits while weakening Muslim commercial powers and undercutting Italian trading cities. It was not simply an economic dream anymore. It had become a national mission. Under King Afonso V, exploration along the African coast accelerated further. Portuguese sailors moved steadily southward into the Gulf of Guinea, reaching regions rich in gold and trade opportunities. The Portuguese crown increasingly mixed state-sponsored exploration with private commercial ventures. Merchants funded voyages in exchange for monopoly rights and shares of future profits. One of the most important figures of this era was Fernão Gomes, a wealthy Lisbon merchant who in 1469 signed an agreement with the crown granting him rights to trade and explore parts of West Africa. Gomes financed expeditions that pushed farther than ever before. Portuguese navigators crossed the equator, reached modern Ghana, and encountered powerful African trading networks already deeply connected to regional commerce. The Gold Coast became especially important. Portuguese traders discovered that West African kingdoms possessed substantial gold reserves. Soon forts and trading posts appeared along the coastline. In 1482, the Portuguese constructed São Jorge de Mina, better known today as Elmina Castle, in present-day Ghana. It became one of the first major European fortified trading posts in sub-Saharan Africa. The structure symbolized a new stage of empire. Portugal was no longer merely exploring. It was establishing permanent commercial infrastructure abroad. Gold flowed into Lisbon. Maps improved. Navigational confidence grew stronger. Yet one great question remained unanswered. Could Africa actually be circumnavigated? For decades, nobody knew. Some believed Africa extended endlessly southward. Others feared impossible oceans beyond the equator. The unknown still dominated geographical understanding. But the Portuguese crown remained determined. Then came King João II. Ascending the throne in 1481, João II proved far more aggressive and focused than many of his predecessors. Intelligent, ambitious, and ruthless when necessary, he centralized royal authority and tightened crown control over overseas ventures. He understood that exploration was too important to leave entirely in private hands. João too wanted results. He reorganized navigation programs, improved map-making operations, and gathered every possible fragment of information from returning sailors. Under his rule, Portuguese expeditions became increasingly systematic. Stone markers called padros were placed along coastlines to mark Portuguese claims and record discoveries. Exploration became not just adventure, but state strategy. At the same time, João pursued intelligence beyond the seas themselves. He sent secret agents eastward overland to gather information about India, the spice trade, and Muslim-controlled commercial routes. Among them were Pero de Covilhã and Afonso de Paiva, who traveled through the Middle East and into India disguised as merchants. Their reports provided crucial information about Indian Ocean trade networks and confirmed something incredibly important. India could indeed be reached by sea around Africa. Now Portugal only needed someone capable of proving it. That man was Bartolomé Dias. In 1487, Dias departed Portugal commanding a small fleet tasked with pushing farther south than any European expedition before him. His voyage became one of the most important in maritime history. The journey was brutal. Storms battered the ships. Winds drove them far into unfamiliar waters. For days and perhaps weeks, Dias and his crew lost sight of land entirely. The Atlantic Ocean became a violent, terrifying force beyond anything most sailors had experienced. Then something strange happened. When Dias eventually turned eastward and then northward searching for the African coastline, he realized the coast now lay to his left rather than his right. Without fully understanding it at first, Dias had passed the southern tip of Africa. The impossible had happened. Africa could be sailed around. The Atlantic and Indian Oceans were connected. The dream Portugal had pursued for generations was real. On the return journey, Dias sighted the great southern cape itself. Because of the savage weather encountered there, he named it the Cape of Storms. But King João II immediately renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, recognizing what it truly represented. Hope. Hope of direct access to Asia. Hope of unimaginable wealth. Hope that Portugal might reshape global trade forever. Yet despite the achievement, Dias never reached India itself. His exhausted crew demanded to return home before the expedition ventured farther into unknown waters. The route existed, but completing it would require another voyage. Meanwhile, events elsewhere intensified the urgency. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed westward under the Spanish crown and reached the Americas, believing he had found Asia. Spain suddenly appeared poised to compete directly with Portugal for overseas expansion. The rivalry between the two Iberian kingdoms became dangerous enough that papal intervention followed. In 1494, Portugal and Spain signed the Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing newly discovered non-European territories between them along an imaginary line in the Atlantic Ocean. Lands east of the line belonged to Portugal. Lands west belonged largely to Spain. At the time, nobody fully understood how significant that agreement would become, especially regarding a distant land later called Brazil. But before Brazil rose to prominence, Portugal remained obsessed with India. In 1495, King Manuel I succeeded João II. Young, ambitious, and eager for glory, Manuel inherited the project of reaching India. He believed Portugal stood on the verge of greatness and wanted to complete the mission that earlier kings had pursued for generations. To command the expedition, he selected Vasco da Gama. Da Gama was not the obvious romantic hero later generations imagined. He came from minor nobility and possessed experience in naval enforcement and royal service. But he was also hard, disciplined, and capable of ruthless decisions. Those qualities mattered because the voyage ahead would demand extraordinary endurance. In July 1497, Vasco da Gama departed Lisbon with 4 ships and roughly 170 men. Crowds gathered along the waterfront as the fleet prepared to leave. Many sailors knew they might never return. Ocean voyages of such scale remained terrifyingly uncertain. Disease, storms, mutiny, and starvation constantly threatened long-distance expeditions. The fleet followed familiar routes down the West African coast before swinging far into the Atlantic to take advantage of prevailing winds. Portuguese navigators had learned something crucial over decades of exploration. Sometimes the fastest route involved sailing away from land entirely. Weeks became months. The ships rounded the Cape of Good Hope and entered waters no European fleet had previously navigated from the Atlantic side. Conditions deteriorated constantly. Food spoiled. Scurvy ravaged crews. Men died from disease and exhaustion. Istiu, da gama puxa de varte. As the fleet sailed up the eastern coast of Africa, the Portuguese entered a world unlike anything they had previously encountered. The Swahili coast contained prosperous trading cities connected to Indian Ocean commerce for centuries. Arab, Persian, African, and Indian merchants traded gold, ivory, spices, textiles, and enslaved people across enormous maritime networks stretching from East Africa to India and beyond. The Portuguese quickly realized something humbling. The Indian Ocean was not an unexplored frontier awaiting European discovery. It was already a highly sophisticated commercial world, and the Portuguese were outsiders entering it. Initial encounters were tense. In Mozambique and Mombasa, local rulers viewed the newcomers with suspicion. Cultural misunderstandings multiplied. Portuguese attempts to present themselves as important Christian allies often failed because local Muslim merchants immediately recognized them as intruders threatening established trade systems. The expedition nearly collapsed. Then, in the city of Malindi, da Gama secured crucial assistance. A skilled navigator familiar with Indian Ocean monsoon patterns agreed to guide the fleet across open waters toward India. Historians still debate the pilot's exact identity, but his expertise proved essential. Using seasonal winds, the Portuguese crossed the Indian Ocean itself. Finally, in May 1498, Vasco da Gama reached Calicut on India's southwestern coast. The moment changed world history. For the first time, a European fleet had reached India entirely by sea. The Portuguese had done what generations thought impossible. But the arrival itself was awkward, tense, and far from triumphant at first. Calicut was one of the major trading centers of the Indian Ocean world, ruled by the Zamorine. The city bustled with merchants from across Asia and the Middle East. Compared to the immense wealth and sophistication of Indian commerce, the Portuguese appeared unimpressive. Da Gama's gifts especially caused embarrassment. The Portuguese presented items they considered respectable by European standards: cloth, hats, coral, and metal goods. But Indian elites accustomed to luxury trade found them laughably modest. According to later accounts, local merchants reportedly mocked the gifts openly. The Portuguese had expected astonishment. Instead, they encountered indifference. Still, da Gama succeeded in opening limited trade negotiations and gathering valuable information. More importantly, he proved the route existed and could be repeated. The return voyage was catastrophic in human cost. Scurvy devastated the crews. Many sailors died. Ships struggled through storms and exhaustion. By the time da Gama returned to Portugal in 1499, fewer than half the original expedition members survived. Yet despite the losses, Lisbon erupted in celebration. The profits from the voyage alone justified the entire expedition many times over. King Manuel, I had understood immediately what had happened. Portugal had broken the old trade system. No longer dependent on overland routes controlled by Muslim powers and Italian merchants, Europe now possessed direct maritime access to India. Portugal stood at the center of this transformation. The consequences rippled across the world. Venetian merchants feared economic collapse. Muslim trading networks recognized a dangerous new competitor. European rulers suddenly understood that oceanic exploration could generate immense wealth and geopolitical power. And Portugal moved quickly to secure its advantage. Within months, new fleets departed Lisbon toward India, carrying merchants, soldiers, diplomats, priests, and administrators. The crown no longer viewed exploration merely as discovery. Now the goal was domination. The Portuguese wanted more than access to trade. They wanted control over it. The voyages that followed became increasingly militarized. Ships carried heavy cannons capable of devastating coastal cities and merchant fleets. Portuguese commanders understood that they lacked the manpower to conquer massive territories inland, but they believed naval superiority could allow them to dominate key maritime routes. This strategy would shape the entire Portuguese Empire. Rather than controlling huge inland populations like later colonial empires, Portugal focused on strategic choke points: ports, harbors, islands, and trade routes. It was an empire built on mobility and sea power, and the Indian Ocean would become its first great battlefield. In 1500, another expedition commanded by Pedro Álvares Cabral departed Portugal, aiming to strengthen relations in India. During the voyage, Cabral's fleet swung far westward into the Atlantic, eventually sighting the coast of Brazil. He claimed the territory for Portugal under the Treaty of Tordesillas before continuing eastward toward India. The accidental discovery would later transform the empire. But at the time, India remained the priority. When Cabral reached Calicut, tensions exploded almost immediately. Muslim merchants viewed the Portuguese as dangerous competitors, threatening established trade networks. Violence erupted in the city. Portuguese traders were killed. Cabral responded brutally. Portuguese ships bombarded Calicut from the sea, marking the beginning of a pattern that would define Portuguese expansion in Asia. Commerce backed by overwhelming naval violence. Unable to secure stable relations there, Cabral moved southward to Cochin, where local rulers proved more willing to cooperate against rivals. The Portuguese established trading posts and alliances, laying the foundations for permanent presence in India. Then came the man who transformed Portuguese ambitions into a true imperial system: Afonso de Albuquerque. Few figures in Portuguese history shaped the empire more decisively than Albuquerque. Appointed governor of Portuguese India in the early 16th century, he possessed extraordinary strategic vision combined with relentless determination. Albuquerque understood something critical. Portugal could never dominate Asia through numbers alone. The kingdom simply lacked the population and resources to conquer vast territories like India or China. Instead, Albuquerque envisioned controlling maritime choke points, forcing Asian trade networks to operate under Portuguese supervision. His strategy was brilliant and ruthless. Capture key ports, fortify strategic harbors, control narrow sea passages, use naval power to tax and regulate commerce. In essence, Albuquerque sought to build a maritime empire capable of dominating global trade routes without requiring massive territorial conquest. His first major triumph came in 1510 with the conquest of Goa. Located on India's western coast, Goa possessed an excellent harbor and strategic access to regional trade networks. Albuquerque seized the city after fierce fighting and transformed it into the capital of Portuguese India. Goa quickly became far more than a military base. Churches rose across the city. European architecture mixed with Indian influences. Merchants, priests, soldiers, artisans, and settlers flooded in. Portuguese authorities encouraged intermarriage and settlement, hoping to create stable colonial communities. For centuries afterward, Goa would remain the beating heart of Portuguese Asia. But Albuquerque was only getting started. In 1511, he attacked Malacca, one of the most important trading ports in Southeast Asia. Whoever controlled Malacca controlled access between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. The battle was fierce. Portuguese cannons blasted defenses while soldiers stormed the city. After victory, Albuquerque fortified Malacca heavily, understanding its strategic value immediately. Now Portugal stood astride one of the world's most important commercial arteries. The empire stretched farther east than ever before. And still, the Portuguese wanted more. By the early 16th century, Portugal had achieved something that no European kingdom had ever accomplished before. In less than 100 years, a small Atlantic nation had transformed itself from a regional kingdom into a maritime power operating across enormous distances. Portuguese ships now sailed regularly between Europe, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. Lisbon overflowed with spices, silk, ivory, precious stones, exotic animals, and merchants speaking languages from every corner of the known world. Foreign visitors arriving in the Portuguese capital described a city unlike any other in Europe, crowded with sailors, traders, diplomats, missionaries, and fortune seekers. And yet beneath the excitement and wealth, the empire remained fragile. Portugal did not possess endless manpower. It did not have giant armies capable of conquering huge inland civilizations. The Ottoman Empire, the Safavids, the Mughal states, and the Ming dynasty all dwarfed Portugal in population and military strength. The Portuguese understood this reality very clearly. That was why Afonso de Albuquerque's strategy mattered so much. Rather than trying to conquer entire regions, the Portuguese aimed to dominate movement itself. They focused on narrow sea lanes, strategic harbors, fortified islands, and critical ports. Whoever controlled those points could influence global trade far beyond the size of their kingdom. And Albuquerque intended to control as many of those points as possible. After seizing Goa in 1510 and Malacca in 1511, Albuquerque continued expanding Portuguese influence across the Indian Ocean. Goa became the administrative center of Portuguese Asia, but Malacca opened an entirely different world. The city sat at the crossroads of Asian maritime commerce. Ships from India, Arabia, China, Japan, and Southeast Asia converged there carrying spices, porcelain, silk, sandalwood, tea, precious metals, and luxury goods Europeans had only dreamed about. When the Portuguese entered Malacca, they entered one of the busiest commercial systems on Earth. The local population itself reflected this diversity. Malay merchants traded beside Gujaratis, Chinese traders, Arab navigators, Tamil financiers, and Javanese sailors. Languages mixed in the marketplaces. Religions overlapped. Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, and local traditions all interacted within the same urban environment. The Portuguese immediately recognized the city's value. Albuquerque ordered the construction of a powerful fortress called a Formosa, designed to secure Portuguese dominance over the harbor. Cannons lined the walls. Portuguese warships patrolled surrounding waters. Taxes and trade regulations followed quickly. The empire was beginning to function not merely as a network of discoveries, but as a military commercial system enforced through armed sea power. But controlling Malacca also opened routes farther east. Beyond Southeast Asia lay the legendary Spice Islands, the Moluccas. For Europeans, spices had almost mythical importance. Cloves, nutmeg, and mace came from only a handful of islands in modern Indonesia, making them extraordinarily valuable. In some European markets, spices could sell for many times their original purchase price. Entire fortunes depended on controlling this trade. Portuguese expeditions pushed deeper into Southeast Asia, searching for direct access to these islands. The voyages were difficult and dangerous. Tropical diseases devastated crews. Navigation became complicated among thousands of islands and unpredictable monsoon systems. Local rulers shifted alliances constantly. Muslim trading networks resisted Portuguese intrusion. Yet little by little, Portuguese influence spread into the region. By the 1520s, Portuguese traders and soldiers had reached the Banda Islands and Ternate. Forts and trading stations appeared. Alliances formed with local rulers eager to use Portuguese military support against regional rivals. Still, Portugal's control remained limited. Unlike later colonial empires that would dominate huge territories directly, the Portuguese often depended on fragile agreements, naval intimidation, and small fortified outposts. A few hundred Portuguese soldiers might defend positions surrounded by thousands of local inhabitants. Every victory required constant negotiation, diplomacy, and force. And yet somehow, the system worked, at least for a while. The empire's reach continued extending farther east than any European power had ever gone before. Soon Portuguese attention turned toward China. To Europeans, China occupied an almost legendary status. Stories of immense wealth, sophisticated cities, fine silk, and powerful emperors had circulated for centuries through travelers like Marco Polo. But very few Europeans possessed direct experience with the Chinese world. The Ming dynasty at this time was among the strongest and most sophisticated states on earth. Its bureaucracy governed millions of people through complex administrative systems. Chinese cities dwarfed most European urban centers in size and organization. Trade networks stretched across Asia. Compared to Portugal, Ming China represented a civilization on a completely different scale. The Portuguese entered this world cautiously. In 1513, Jorge Alvarez became one of the first known Portuguese explorers to reach southern China by sea. Initial contact brought curiosity on both sides, but also confusion and tension. Portuguese traders behaved aggressively at times, engaging in smuggling and unauthorized commerce. Some incidents reportedly involved kidnappings and violent behavior that outraged Chinese officials. Relations deteriorated rapidly. In 1521 and 1522, Portuguese fleets clashed with Ming naval forces near the Pearl River Delta. The Chinese successfully drove them away. Portuguese attempts to establish formal diplomatic relations initially failed badly. For a moment, it appeared Portugal might be excluded from China entirely. But Portuguese merchants remained persistent. Over the following decades, more cautious approaches emerged. Trade continued unofficially through intermediaries and negotiated arrangements. Chinese authorities gradually realized that limited commercial cooperation with the Portuguese could be beneficial if properly controlled. Then, in 1557, the Portuguese secured one of the most important agreements in the empire's history. They received permission to establish a settlement at Macau. Macau began as a small fishing village near the mouth of the Pearl River, strategically located close to Canton, one of China's major commercial hubs. Unlike many Portuguese possessions elsewhere, Macau was not conquered militarily. Instead, it existed through Chinese authorization and supervision. The Portuguese paid annual rent and accepted restrictions imposed by Ming authorities. Yet despite these limitations, Macau became enormously important. The city evolved into the primary gateway connecting China with Europe through maritime trade. Portuguese merchants carried Chinese silk, porcelain, lacquerware, and tea across the oceans while bringing silver and other goods into East Asia. Macau became one of the first truly global commercial cities, linking Chinese markets to Japan, Southeast Asia, India, Africa, and Europe simultaneously. Walking through Macau during the late 16th century would have revealed a remarkable cultural mixture. Chinese residents lived alongside Portuguese settlers, missionaries, merchants, African slaves, Indian traders, and mixed heritage families later known as Macanese. Churches rose beside Chinese temples. European architectural styles blended with Asian influences. Languages mixed in the streets. Macau represented the Portuguese Empire at its most interconnected. And from Macau, Portuguese influence expanded even farther east toward Japan. The first Portuguese arrival in Japan happened almost accidentally in 1543 when traders landed near Tanegashima Island after storms pushed their ship off course. The Japanese response was immediate fascination, especially regarding one specific item the Portuguese carried: firearms. The arquebus, introduced by the Portuguese, rapidly transformed Japanese warfare. Japan at the time was fractured by civil conflict during the Sengoku period, an age of competing warlords struggling for dominance. Daimyo quickly recognized the military value of European guns. Japanese craftsmen began reproducing the weapons with astonishing speed. Within decades, firearms became a major factor in Japanese warfare. But Portuguese influence extended beyond weapons. Trade between Macau and Japan soon became one of the most profitable routes in Asia. Portuguese merchants transported Chinese silk to Japan and returned carrying Japanese silver, copper, and luxury goods. The profits were enormous. Some Portuguese traders became fabulously wealthy through this triangular trade network linking China, Japan, and Southeast Asia. At the same time, religion entered the picture in dramatic fashion. In 1549, a Jesuit missionary named Francis Xavier arrived in Japan. Xavier was one of the founding members of the Society of Jesus, commonly known as the Jesuits. Few missionary figures in history traveled as widely or as passionately as he did. Sent under Portuguese patronage, Xavier had already worked in India and Southeast Asia before reaching Japan. What he encountered surprised him. Japanese society was highly organized, literate, disciplined, and intellectually sophisticated. Xavier quickly realized that missionary work in Japan required adaptation rather than simple preaching. The Jesuits began studying Japanese language and customs carefully. They adjusted clothing, communication styles, and educational methods to fit local society. And unexpectedly, Christianity began spreading. Some daimyo converted for strategic reasons, hoping to gain commercial advantages and Portuguese weapons. Others appeared genuinely interested in Christian teachings. Churches appeared in Kyushu and other regions. Japanese converts adopted Christian names and practices. Seminaries and schools opened. By the late 16th century, tens of thousands of Japanese Christians existed. For a brief moment, it even seemed possible that Christianity might establish a permanent major presence within Japan. Portuguese missionaries viewed this as one of their greatest successes. But success created suspicion. As powerful leaders like Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, and eventually Tokugawa Ieyasu moved toward unifying Japan, foreign influence became increasingly concerning. Christian converts owed spiritual allegiance to an outside religion linked closely with European traders and imperial powers. Japanese rulers began asking dangerous questions. Were missionaries preparing the ground for conquest? Could divided loyalties threaten political stability? Would Christianity undermine traditional authority? The atmosphere slowly changed. By the 1580s and 1590s, restrictions intensified. Missionaries faced growing pressure. Some converts suffered persecution. Under the Tokugawa shogunate in the early 17th century, Christianity was eventually banned entirely. Churches were destroyed. Foreign missionaries expelled or executed. Japanese Christians were forced underground into hidden communities that survived secretly for generations. Portuguese access to Japan also shrank dramatically. The era of open exchange ended. Still, the impact of Portuguese contact on Japan remained significant. Firearms altered warfare. New trade networks expanded economic activity. Linguistic traces entered Japanese vocabulary. European maps and scientific knowledge circulated among intellectual circles. Meanwhile, throughout Asia, Portuguese influence continued evolving in different ways. In India, Goa grew into the empire's central administrative and religious capital. Portuguese governors ruled from grand residences, while churches, monasteries, and markets expanded across the city. Jesuit colleges educated local elites and trained missionaries for service throughout Asia. Goa became known as the Rome of the East. But the city also reflected the contradictions of empire. European architecture stood beside Indian traditions. Catholic processions moved through streets filled with Hindu temples and Muslim merchants. Portuguese authorities promoted conversion aggressively, while also depending economically on local populations who maintained their own cultural identities. Intermarriage became relatively common compared to some later European colonial systems. Mixed communities emerged across Portuguese territories, producing complex societies shaped by European, African, Indian, Malay, and Chinese influences. The Portuguese Empire was never culturally uniform. Instead, it became a network of interconnected hybrid worlds. In many places, Portuguese language spread not because huge populations of settlers arrived, but because it became useful for trade and communication. Creole languages emerged, combining Portuguese vocabulary with local grammar and pronunciation. Elements of Portuguese cuisine, architecture, religion, and law blended into local societies across multiple continents. At the same time, violence remained central to imperial expansion. Portuguese warships enforced monopolies through cannon fire. Merchant ships without Portuguese licenses could be seized or destroyed. Rivals faced brutal retaliation. Muslim traders especially became frequent targets because the Portuguese viewed them as both commercial competitors and religious enemies. The Cartaz system symbolized this dominance. Under this policy, merchant vessels operating in the Indian Ocean were often required to purchase Portuguese permits granting safe passage. Ships lacking these permits risked attack by Portuguese patrols. In effect, Portugal attempted to tax and regulate maritime trade across enormous regions despite having relatively limited manpower. The system generated huge profits, but it also created enemies everywhere. The Ottoman Empire viewed Portuguese expansion into the Indian Ocean as a serious threat to Muslim commercial networks. Ottoman fleets eventually challenged Portuguese dominance in the Red Sea and Persian Gulf. Local Indian rulers resisted Portuguese interference repeatedly. Southeast Asian sultanates fought against Portuguese influence in the Malay world. Even within the empire itself, corruption spread rapidly. The distances involved were enormous. Communication between Lisbon and Asia could take many months. Colonial officials often enriched themselves through smuggling, bribery, and private trade. Governors competed for power. Soldiers mutinied over poor conditions and unpaid wages. Maintaining such a vast system strained Portugal constantly. And yet, despite all these problems, by the mid-16th century, the Portuguese Empire had accomplished something astonishing. It stretched from Brazil in the west to Japan in the east. Portuguese ships connected the Atlantic Ocean, Indian Ocean, South China Sea, and Pacific trade routes. Lisbon became one of the world's great commercial capitals. Goods from Asia flowed into Europe in unprecedented quantities. European understanding of geography expanded dramatically because of Portuguese exploration and cartography. Most importantly, Portugal had created the first truly global empire in history. Not the largest, not the richest in raw territorial size, but the first empire whose trade routes, settlements, military outposts, and cultural influence operated across nearly the entire known world. The achievement was extraordinary, but hidden beneath the triumph was a dangerous weakness. Portugal's empire depended on constant movement, fragile alliances, naval supremacy, and uninterrupted trade. It relied heavily on a relatively small number of ships, officials, merchants, and soldiers spread across immense distances. And powerful rivals were watching carefully. Spain was expanding rapidly in the Americas. The Ottoman Empire challenged Portuguese influence in the East. New northern European powers like England and the Dutch Republic were beginning to build stronger navies. The age of uncontested Portuguese dominance would not last forever. And while Portugal fought to hold its empire together in Asia, another part of the world was quietly becoming even more important than India itself: Brazil. For much of the early 16th century, Portugal's rulers believed Asia would remain the true center of their empire forever. India, Malacca, China, and the spice trade captured the imagination of kings, merchants, and adventurers alike. The profits coming from pepper, cinnamon, silk, and porcelain were staggering by European standards. Lisbon had become the doorway through which Asian luxury goods entered Europe. Every ship returning from the Indian Ocean carried wealth capable of transforming noble families overnight. And because of this success, Brazil initially seemed almost secondary. When Pedro Álvares Cabral accidentally reached the Brazilian coast in 1500 while sailing toward India, the discovery attracted interest but not immediate obsession. Compared to the bustling trade systems of Asia, Brazil appeared underdeveloped from a European perspective. There were no giant cities filled with merchants, no organized spice markets, no established commercial networks capable of generating immediate fortunes. At first glance, it looked like a distant wilderness. But empires often change direction slowly, almost without realizing it. And over time, Portugal would discover that Brazil possessed something incredibly valuable: land. Huge amounts of land. Fertile land. Land capable of producing one of the most profitable commodities in the early modern world: sugar. In the early decades after Cabral's arrival, Portuguese activity in Brazil remained limited mostly to coastal trade. Explorers and merchants focused heavily on extracting Brazil wood, a tree whose reddish dye became highly prized in European textile industries. Indigenous groups often participated in this trade, exchanging labor or harvested wood for European metal tools, cloth, knives, and other goods. Yet even during this early phase, conflict and exploitation emerged quickly. The Portuguese encounter hundreds of indigenous communities along Brazil's coastline, speaking different languages and following diverse traditions. Some groups welcomed trade relationships. Others resisted fiercely. Europeans often misunderstood local political structures completely, assuming fragmented communities lacked organized authority, when in reality, many indigenous societies operated through complex social systems Europeans failed to recognize. Disease also arrived almost immediately. European illnesses such as smallpox, influenza, and measles devastated indigenous populations who possessed no immunity. Entire communities collapsed within decades of first contact. The demographic catastrophe transformed Brazil long before Portuguese colonial control fully expanded inland. Still, for several decades, Portugal remained more focused on Asia. That changed during the 1530s. Foreign rivals forced the Portuguese crown to pay closer attention to Brazil. French ships increasingly appeared along the Brazilian coast, trading with indigenous communities and threatening Portuguese claims. Lisbon realized that symbolic possession meant little without actual colonization. So the crown launched a more serious settlement program. King João III divided Brazil into hereditary captaincies, long strips of coastal territory granted to nobles and investors responsible for developing and defending them. The idea resembled feudal colonization. In theory, local captains would finance settlements, establish agriculture, and maintain order while remaining loyal to the Portuguese crown. In practice, many captaincies failed. Disease, isolation, indigenous resistance, lack of resources, and poor management destroyed several early settlements. But a few regions succeeded spectacularly, especially Pernambuco and Bahia. There, Portuguese colonists discovered that Brazil's climate and soil were ideal for sugarcane cultivation. Sugar production itself was labor-intensive, technologically demanding, and enormously profitable. Plantations required mills, large workforces, transportation systems, and constant maintenance. But European demand for sugar kept rising rapidly. What had once been a luxury for elites was becoming increasingly important across European markets. The profits were irresistible, and this transformed Brazil permanently. By the mid-16th century, sugar plantations spread across northeastern Brazil's coastline. Forests were cleared. Plantation estates expanded. Colonial towns grew around export economies tied directly to Europe. In 1549, the Portuguese crown centralized administration further by appointing Tomé de Souza as Brazil's first governor-general. He founded Salvador de Bahia, which became the colony's capital and administrative center. Churches, forts, warehouses, and government buildings followed. Brazil was no longer a peripheral outpost. It was becoming essential to Portugal's future. But sugar production created a massive problem: labor. Plantations consumed workers relentlessly. Sugar cultivation and processing demanded exhausting physical labor under brutal tropical conditions. Portuguese colonists initially attempted to enslave indigenous populations to meet labor demands. Some indigenous people were captured during raids known as bandeiras. Others were forced into labor through warfare, intimidation, or manipulated alliances. Missionaries occasionally protested abuses, but exploitation remained widespread. Yet the system proved unstable. Indigenous groups resisted fiercely. Many escaped into the interior. Others died in catastrophic numbers from disease and overwork. Colonists constantly complained about labor shortages. And so Portuguese attention increasingly shifted toward Africa. For decades, Portugal had already maintained trading networks and fortified posts along the African coast. Places like Elmina, Luanda, and other settlements connected Portuguese merchants to regional African trade systems involving gold, ivory, and enslaved captives. Now these African networks became central to Brazil's economy. The transatlantic slave trade expanded dramatically. It is impossible to understand the Portuguese Empire without confronting this reality directly. Slavery became one of the empire's foundations. The wealth generated by sugar plantations, mining operations, and colonial agriculture depended heavily on forced African labor. And Portugal became one of the principal architects of the Atlantic slave system. The process itself was horrifying. Portuguese traders rarely captured most enslaved Africans personally deep inland. Instead, they operated through complex networks involving African kingdoms, merchants, and intermediaries. Wars, raids, political rivalries, and kidnapping supplied captives who were then sold to European traders at coastal ports. Goods such as firearms, metal products, textiles, alcohol, and manufactured items flowed into Africa. Human beings flowed out. Once purchased, enslaved Africans endured the Middle Passage, the Atlantic crossing toward the Americas. Conditions aboard slave ships were catastrophic. Men, women, and children were packed tightly into filthy holds with minimal food, water, or sanitation. Disease spread rapidly. Violence and abuse were constant. Many died before reaching Brazil. Those who survived entered plantation systems defined by relentless labor and punishment. Brazil eventually received more enslaved Africans than any other region in the Americas. Over centuries, millions of Africans were transported there. Their labor transformed Brazil into one of the world's largest sugar producers and later supported gold mining, urban construction, cattle ranching, and countless other colonial industries. Yet despite unimaginable suffering, enslaved Africans carried cultures, religions, languages, agricultural knowledge, music, and traditions that profoundly shaped Brazilian society. African influence became inseparable from Brazil itself. Cuisine changed. Music evolved. Religious traditions blended together. Languages mixed. Communities formed despite oppression. Across Brazil, African cultural practices survived and adapted under brutal conditions. Religious syncretism especially became widespread. Catholic saints merged symbolically with African spiritual traditions, creating religious systems that preserved ancestral beliefs beneath outward Christian forms. Capoeira, samba, candomblé, and countless other aspects of Brazilian culture eventually emerged from this fusion of African, indigenous, and Portuguese influences. The Portuguese Empire was creating wealth through violence, but it was also unintentionally creating entirely new societies. Meanwhile, Portuguese involvement in Africa itself deepened. At first, Portugal had focused mainly on coastal trading networks rather than massive territorial conquest inland. But growing demand for enslaved labor encouraged greater intervention in African politics and warfare. In the Kingdom of Congo, Portuguese missionaries and diplomats established close relationships with local rulers during the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The Congolese king Nzinga Nkuwu converted to Christianity and took the name João after the Portuguese king. His son, Afonso I, embraced Christianity even more deeply and attempted to build a Christian African kingdom allied with Portugal. For a time, the relationship appeared cooperative. Congo adopted elements of European administration, religion, and literacy. Diplomatic letters passed between African kings and European monarchs. Congolese nobles studied Christianity and Portuguese customs. But beneath the alliance, tensions grew constantly. The slave trade destabilized everything. Portuguese traders increasingly ignored royal authority, purchasing captives illegally and fueling violence throughout the region. Afonso I repeatedly complained to Portugal that uncontrolled slave raiding was destroying his kingdom. His warnings largely went ignored. Profit mattered more. Farther south, Portuguese involvement in Angola became increasingly militarized. Luanda, founded in 1575, evolved into one of the Atlantic slave trade's major export centers. Portuguese forces fought wars against African kingdoms while attempting to secure access to captives and trade routes. Resistance remained fierce. African rulers did not simply surrender passively to European expansion. Powerful states like Ndongo resisted Portuguese encroachment repeatedly. One of the most famous leaders, Queen Nzinga of Ndongo in Matamba, became legendary for her diplomatic skill and military resistance against Portuguese domination during the 17th century. She negotiated, fought, formed alliances, and adapted strategically to survive within an increasingly violent colonial world. Across both Africa and Brazil, the empire grew through constant conflict. And still, wealth poured into Portugal. Sugar exports exploded during the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Brazilian plantations generated fortunes for colonial elites and merchants connected to Atlantic trade networks. Lisbon benefited enormously as goods moved constantly between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The Atlantic Ocean itself became the empire's economic heart. Ships rarely traveled empty. European manufactured goods moved to Africa. Enslaved Africans crossed to Brazil. Sugar, tobacco, and later gold returned to Europe. This triangular system connected continents through commerce and coercion on a massive scale. By now, Portugal's empire operated on two distinct but interconnected axes. In the east, the Estado de India controlled maritime trade routes linking Europe to Asia. In the west, Brazil and the Atlantic slave economy generated agricultural wealth through plantation labor. For a time, the combination seemed unstoppable, but cracks were already beginning to appear. Portugal's resources remained limited. Maintaining far-flung outposts across multiple continents required enormous spending. Corruption spread widely among colonial officials. Smuggling undermined royal monopolies constantly. Rival European powers watched Portuguese success with growing envy. The Dutch especially were preparing to strike. Unlike Portugal, the Dutch Republic possessed expanding financial institutions, highly efficient shipping industries, and powerful commercial companies capable of mobilizing enormous resources. Dutch merchants wanted direct access to Asian spices and Atlantic sugar profits, and they were willing to fight for it. At the same time, political disaster struck Portugal itself. In 1578, King Sebastian of Portugal launched a crusading expedition into Morocco, hoping to achieve military glory against Muslim forces. The campaign ended catastrophically at the Battle of Alcácer Quibir. Sebastian disappeared during the battle. His body was never definitively identified. Much of Portugal's nobility died alongside him. The kingdom entered a succession crisis. After brief political instability, Philip II of Spain claimed the Portuguese throne in 1580, creating the Iberian Union. Portugal remained technically separate, retaining its laws and institutions, but it now shared a monarch with Spain. This changed global politics immediately. Portugal's enemies became Spain's enemies, and Spain's enemies became Portugal's enemies. The Dutch and English, already fighting Spain elsewhere, now attacked Portuguese territories across the world. Suddenly, Portugal's vast but thinly defended empire faced assaults from multiple directions simultaneously. Dutch fleets targeted Portuguese shipping routes. English privateers raided Atlantic commerce. Asian rivals challenged Portuguese monopolies. The age of easy expansion was ending. And in Brazil itself, another transformation was beginning. Deep inland, beyond the sugar coast, explorers and adventurers known as banderanis were moving into the interior, searching for something even more valuable than sugar: gold. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Portuguese Empire still stretched across the globe. On maps, it appeared enormous. Forts in Africa, ports in India, trading posts in Southeast Asia, settlements in Brazil, and enclaves in China all remained connected under the Portuguese crown. Ships still crossed the oceans carrying spices, sugar, silver, slaves, and luxury goods. Lisbon still projected the image of imperial prestige. But beneath the surface, the empire was entering a dangerous new era. The age when Portugal could dominate through surprise, innovation, and naval superiority alone was ending. Other European powers had learned from the Portuguese example, and now they intended to take its place. The Dutch Republic emerged as the most serious threat. During the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the Dutch were transforming into one of the world's greatest maritime and commercial powers. Amsterdam became a financial center unlike anything Europe had seen before. Dutch shipbuilders produced vessels faster and cheaper than competitors. Investors pooled capital through powerful joint stock companies, especially the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602. Unlike Portugal's empire, which relied heavily on royal administration and scattered noble patronage, the Dutch operated with highly organized commercial systems backed by modern finance and military force. And because Portugal was now under the Spanish crown through the Iberian Union, Dutch hostility toward Spain expanded naturally into attacks on Portuguese possessions. The Dutch did not merely want to disrupt Portuguese trade. They wanted to replace it entirely. The struggle began across multiple oceans at once. In Asia, Dutch fleets targeted Portuguese shipping routes and forts. The spice trade became the central battlefield. The Dutch East India Company understood that controlling cloves, nutmeg, and mace meant controlling some of the most profitable commodities in the world. Portuguese outposts in Indonesia suddenly faced relentless competition. The Dutch proved ruthless and efficient. They forged alliances with local rulers hostile to Portuguese influence. They blockaded ports, attacked fortresses, and seized islands one by one. Unlike the Portuguese, who often depended on fragile networks spread thinly across enormous distances, the Dutch concentrated resources strategically. Bit by bit, Portugal lost ground. The Spice Islands gradually slipped from Portuguese control into Dutch hands. Malacca, one of the crown jewels of the Estado de India, fell to the Dutch in 1641 after a long siege. Portuguese influence in Southeast Asia shrank dramatically. In the Indian Ocean, Portuguese naval supremacy also weakened. The Ottoman Empire, Persian forces, and local Indian powers challenged Portuguese control repeatedly. Hormuz, the strategic fortress guarding the Persian Gulf, was captured in 1622 by a combined Anglo-Persian force. The loss shattered Portuguese dominance in one of the empire's most important choke points. Everywhere, the same pattern emerged. Portugal had built the first global empire, but maintaining it against rising competitors required resources the kingdom increasingly lacked. The Dutch attacks spread into the Atlantic as well. Brazil became one of the primary targets. Dutch merchants had grown heavily involved in the European sugar trade, especially refining and distributing Brazilian sugar across northern Europe. When war disrupted access to Portuguese colonies, the Dutch decided to seize the source directly. Beginning in the 1620s, Dutch fleets attacked northeastern Brazil. After several failed attempts, they captured large portions of Pernambuco and surrounding sugar-producing regions. The occupation shocked Portugal. Brazil was no longer secondary to the empire. It had become economically vital. The Dutch established a colony known as New Holland under the leadership of Johan Moritz of Nassau. Unlike some colonial governors of the period, Nassau approached administration with surprising sophistication. He encouraged scientific study, urban planning, artistic documentation, and relative religious tolerance. Dutch Brazil briefly became one of the most culturally dynamic colonies in the Atlantic world. Artists painted detailed scenes of Brazilian landscapes, wildlife, indigenous communities, and plantation life. Scientists documented unfamiliar plants and animals. Recife expanded under Dutch administration into a more organized colonial city. Yet beneath this appearance of stability, conflict simmered constantly. Portuguese settlers resented Dutch rule. Catholic populations distrusted Protestant authorities, and the plantation economy remained deeply dependent on slavery and violence. Resistance gradually intensified. Portuguese colonists, local militias, indigenous allies, and Afro-Brazilian fighters launched repeated uprisings against Dutch control. Guerrilla warfare spread across the countryside. Supply lines became difficult to maintain. Finally, after years of conflict, Portuguese forces reconquered Recife in 1654, ending Dutch rule in Brazil permanently. The victory mattered enormously. Had the Dutch retained Brazil, Portuguese imperial history might have ended very differently. Instead, Brazil remained under Portuguese control and soon became even more important than before. Because during the late 17th century, explorers deep in Brazil's interior discovered something that transformed the empire once again: gold. For decades, Banderanis from Sao Paulo had pushed inland searching for indigenous captives, mineral wealth, and new territory. These expeditions were harsh, violent, and often deadly. The Banderanis traveled through dense forests, mountains, rivers, and unfamiliar landscapes far beyond the coastal settlements. Then, in the 1690s, major gold deposits were discovered in the region later known as Minas Gerais. The news spread rapidly. A gold rush exploded across Brazil. Thousands of colonists flooded into the interior. Portuguese immigrants crossed the Atlantic hoping to become rich. Merchants, priests, adventurers, enslaved laborers, and fortune seekers poured toward mining settlements that grew almost overnight. The scale of extraction became enormous. During the 18th century, Brazil produced vast quantities of gold for the Portuguese crown. Ships carried precious metal back to Lisbon in heavily guarded convoys. For a time, Portugal became one of Europe's wealthiest states largely because of Brazilian mining wealth. The transformation reshaped Brazil completely. Previously, colonial development had concentrated mainly along the sugar-producing coastline. Now, major population centers emerged inland. New towns appeared across mountainous mining regions. Roads connected the interior to Atlantic ports. Cities like Ouro Preto, Mariana, and Diamantina flourished. Baroque churches decorated with gold leaf rose dramatically above mining settlements. Wealthy elites sponsored elaborate religious art and architecture. Brazilian colonial culture developed, increasing complexity and local identity. But the gold economy also deepened old systems of exploitation. Mining required massive labor forces. Once again, enslaved Africans became central to production. Hundreds of thousands were transported to Brazil during the mining boom. Conditions in the mines were brutal. Laborers worked long hours in dangerous tunnels and riverbeds under constant supervision and punishment. Mortality rates remained horrifyingly high. And as always, the wealth generated by colonial labor flowed unevenly. The Portuguese crown imposed heavy taxes on Brazilian gold, especially through the quinto, a royal tax claiming 1/5 of all mined gold. Colonial resentment toward taxation and imperial control slowly increased over time. At the same moment, broader global changes were reshaping European power. England, France, and the Netherlands expanded their own colonial empires aggressively. Naval warfare intensified. Atlantic commerce became increasingly competitive. Portugal remained significant, but it no longer dominated global trade the way it once had. Instead, the kingdom survived largely through adaptation and alliances. The oldest and most important of these alliances remained Portugal's relationship with England. The Anglo-Portuguese alliance, dating back to the Treaty of Windsor in 1386, became increasingly valuable during the 17th and 18th centuries. England provided military support and commercial partnerships that helped Portugal preserve independence against stronger continental powers. But the relationship carried costs. British merchants gained enormous influence within Portuguese trade networks. English manufactured goods flooded Portuguese markets. Over time, Portugal became economically dependent in many ways on British commercial power. One agreement symbolized this dependency clearly: the Methuen Treaty of 1703. Under the treaty, Portuguese wines received favorable access to English markets, while Portugal imported English textiles. The arrangement benefited some sectors of the Portuguese economy, especially wine producers in Porto, but it also weakened domestic manufacturing by making Portugal heavily reliant on British industrial imports. Gold from Brazil often flowed indirectly into British hands through trade imbalances. Meanwhile, inside Portugal itself, rulers attempted reforms aimed at strengthening the state. One of the most influential figures of the 18th century was Sebastião José de Carvalho e Melo, better known as the Marquis of Pombal. Pombal rose to power under King José I and became effectively Portugal's chief minister. Intelligent, authoritarian, and deeply influenced by Enlightenment ideas, Pombal sought to modernize the kingdom and reform imperial administration. Then disaster struck Lisbon itself. On the morning of November 1st, 1755, a massive earthquake devastated the Portuguese capital. The destruction was catastrophic. Buildings collapsed across the city. Fires spread uncontrollably. A tsunami followed, flooding parts of Lisbon and killing thousands. Estimates of the death toll vary widely, but tens of thousands likely perished. The psychological shock across Europe was immense. Lisbon had been one of Europe's richest imperial capitals, and suddenly much of it lay in ruins. Pombal responded with remarkable speed and efficiency. He organized rescue efforts, imposed order, and launched one of Europe's first major modern urban reconstruction programs. New districts of Lisbon were rebuilt with innovative anti-earthquake architectural designs. The rebuilding effort strengthened Pombal's authority dramatically. At the same time, he pursued aggressive reforms across the empire. Pombal reduced the power of the nobility and church, expelled the Jesuits from Portuguese territories, reorganized colonial administration, and attempted to stimulate economic modernization. In Brazil, he tightened royal control over mining revenues and administration. Indigenous policies shifted as well, though often in contradictory ways. Pombal promoted assimilation while still maintaining colonial hierarchies and exploitation. Yet despite reforms, deeper structural problems remained. Portugal's population was relatively small. Its empire remained scattered across vast distances. Its economy depended heavily on colonial extraction and foreign trade. And new political ideas were beginning to spread across the Atlantic world. The Enlightenment challenged traditional monarchy and imperial authority. The American Revolution demonstrated that colonies could rebel successfully against European powers. The French Revolution later unleashed even more radical ideas about sovereignty, citizenship, and liberty. These ideological changes eventually reached Brazil too. By the late 18th century, dissatisfaction among Brazilian elites was growing. Heavy taxation, economic controls, and resentment toward Portuguese dominance fueled unrest. One of the earliest conspiracies emerged in Minas Gerais itself, the center of the gold region. Known as the Inconfidência Mineira, the movement involved intellectuals, military officers, priests, and local elites influenced by Enlightenment ideals and the American example. They dreamed of an independent Brazilian republic free from Portuguese taxation. The conspiracy was discovered before it could succeed. Its most famous participant, Joaquim José de Silva Xavier, later known as Tiradentes, was arrested, executed, and dismembered publicly as a warning against rebellion. But the message was already spreading. The empire was changing. Brazil was no longer simply a colony producing wealth for Lisbon. It was becoming a society with its own identity, ambitions, and future political consciousness. At the same time, enslaved populations across the Atlantic world increasingly resisted colonial systems through rebellions, escapes, sabotage, and the creation of independent communities. One of the most famous examples in Brazil had already emerged during the 17th century, Palmares. Hidden in the interior, Palmares became a large settlement founded primarily by escaped enslaved Africans. At its height, it may have contained tens of thousands of inhabitants. Its people defended themselves for decades against Portuguese and Dutch attacks alike. Leaders like Zumbi dos Palmares became symbols of resistance against slavery and colonial oppression. Even when destroyed militarily, communities like Palmares revealed an important truth. The empire's wealth depended on systems constantly challenged by those forced to sustain them, and those tensions were only growing stronger. By the end of the 18th century, Portugal still possessed one of the world's oldest overseas empires. But the balance of power had shifted dramatically since the days of Vasco da Gama and Albuquerque. The Dutch had replaced Portugal as the dominant commercial power in much of Asia. Britain now ruled the seas more effectively than any other European state. Spain's empire faced revolutionary crises in the Americas. And in France, revolution itself had exploded into a force that would soon shake every monarchy in Europe. Then, at the beginning of the 19th century, one man would change the fate of Portugal forever: Napoleon Bonaparte. At the dawn of the 19th century, the Portuguese Empire had already survived challenges that might have destroyed many other states. It had endured Dutch attacks, competition from rising European powers, economic dependency on Britain, and the slow erosion of its dominance in Asia. Yet despite these setbacks, Portugal still possessed something of enormous value: Brazil. By this time, Brazil was no longer simply another colony among many scattered across the globe. It had become the center of the empire's wealth and population. Sugar plantations still generated huge profits. Gold and diamond mining enriched merchants and the crown. Coastal cities expanded rapidly. Ports like Rio de Janeiro, Salvador, and Recife had grown into major Atlantic centers connected to Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Millions of people now lived in Brazil. And unlike Portugal itself, Brazil possessed vast territory, enormous agricultural potential, and growing internal economic networks. The balance inside the empire was beginning to shift. Then Europe exploded into war. The French Revolution at the end of the 18th century had already shaken monarchies across the continent. Kings and nobles watched in horror as revolutionaries overthrew old institutions, executed Louis XVI, and declared radical new political ideas about citizenship and popular sovereignty. Out of this chaos rose Napoleon Bonaparte. Brilliant, ambitious, and relentless, Napoleon transformed revolutionary France into a military superpower. One after another, European armies fell before him. Entire kingdoms collapsed. Borders changed constantly as French influence spread across the continent. Portugal fist un impossible dilemma. For centuries, Portugal's oldest alliance had been with Britain. British trade and naval protection were crucial to the Portuguese economy. But Napoleon demanded that all European states participate in the continental system, an enormous economic blockade designed to isolate Britain from continental trade. Napoleon ordered Portugal to cut ties with the British. The Portuguese crown hesitated. Refusing Napoleon was dangerous. Abandoning Britain was equally dangerous. Portugal attempted neutrality, hoping somehow to survive between two giant powers. It failed. In 1807, Napoleon lost patience. French forces under General Junot invaded Portugal. The Portuguese government faced a terrifying reality. Lisbon could not withstand a full French occupation for long. The royal family risked capture, and unlike many European monarchs who fought and lost against Napoleon, the Portuguese crown made a decision unlike anything seen before in European imperial history. They decided to move the monarchy itself across the Atlantic Ocean. The entire center of the Portuguese Empire would temporarily relocate to Brazil. As French troops advanced toward Lisbon, chaos consumed the capital. Nobles, officials, servants, soldiers, merchants, and desperate civilians crowded the harbor. Valuable archives, royal treasures, documents, paintings, furniture, and religious objects were rushed aboard ships. Then, in one of history's most extraordinary royal evacuations, the Portuguese court fled Europe. In late November 1807, escorted by the British Royal Navy, Prince Regent João, the royal family, and thousands of others sailed for Brazil. Days later, French troops entered Lisbon. Portugal itself was occupied, but the monarchy had escaped. The journey across the Atlantic was difficult and humiliating in many ways. Ships were overcrowded, supplies ran short, storms battered the fleet, disease spread among passengers. Yet after weeks at sea, the royal convoy arrived in Brazil. And suddenly, Rio de Janeiro became the capital of the Portuguese Empire. The consequences were enormous. For the first time in modern colonial history, a European monarchy governed its empire not from Europe, but from an American colony. Brazil's status transformed overnight. The arrival of the royal court changed Rio dramatically. Streets were widened. Government buildings expanded. New institutions appeared rapidly. Libraries, military academies, printing presses, banks, and cultural organizations developed under royal sponsorship. The Prince Regent, later King João VI, understood something crucial. If the monarchy intended to survive in Brazil, the colony could no longer be treated merely as a subordinate territory. Important reforms followed. Brazilian ports were opened to international trade, ending old colonial restrictions that had forced commerce primarily through Portugal. Foreign merchants, especially British traders, flooded into Brazilian markets. Economic activity expanded rapidly. In 1815, Brazil's status rose even further when it was officially elevated from colony to co-equal kingdom within the newly named United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. This was a symbolic revolution. Brazil was no longer legally subordinate to Portugal. It stood beside it, and many Brazilians began realizing something important. If the monarchy itself could govern from Rio de Janeiro, why should Brazil remain politically dependent on Lisbon at all? Meanwhile, events in Europe continued shifting rapidly. Napoleon's empire eventually collapsed after disastrous military campaigns and growing international opposition. By 1815, the French emperor had been defeated and exiled. Across Europe, monarchies attempted to restore stability after decades of war and revolution. Portugal itself emerged devastated. The country had suffered invasion, economic disruption, and political humiliation. British military commanders played major roles in expelling French forces from Portuguese territory, increasing British influence even further. Yet while Portugal struggled to rebuild, Brazil flourished. Rio de Janeiro had become one of the Atlantic world's largest and most dynamic cities. Population growth accelerated. Trade expanded. Local elites gained greater political confidence and influence. And this created tension. Many Portuguese politicians wanted the royal family to return to Lisbon and restore Brazil's old colonial status. They feared the empire's center of gravity had shifted permanently across the Atlantic. In 1820, revolution erupted in Portugal itself. Liberal reformers in Porto demanded constitutional government, political modernization, and the return of the monarchy from Brazil. The movement spread rapidly. Facing pressure, King João VI agreed to return to Lisbon in 1821. But before leaving Brazil, he made a crucial decision. He left his son, Prince Pedro, behind as regent. At first, Lisbon hoped Pedro would preserve imperial unity while restoring tighter Portuguese control over Brazil. Instead, the opposite happened. Brazilian elites increasingly resisted attempts by Portuguese politicians to reduce Brazil once again to colonial dependency. They feared losing the autonomy and economic freedoms gained during the royal court's presence. Pressure mounted constantly. Portuguese authorities ordered Pedro to return to Europe. Many expected him to obey. But in January 1822, Pedro made his famous decision. Standing before supporters in Rio de Janeiro, he declared, "I remain." The moment became known as the Dia do Fico, the Day of Staying. It marked the beginning of Brazil's break from Portugal. Over the following months, tensions escalated rapidly. Brazilian leaders pushed for full independence while Portuguese authorities attempted to reassert control. Political negotiations collapsed. Then, on September 7th, 1822, beside the Ipiranga River near Sao Paulo, Pedro proclaimed Brazil's independence. According to later national mythology, he drew his sword and shouted, "Independence or death." Whether the scene unfolded exactly that way or not, the result was real. Brazil became an independent empire, and remarkably, its first emperor was a Portuguese prince, Dom Pedro I. Unlike the violent independence wars that shattered Spanish America, Brazil's separation from Portugal was comparatively less destructive, though not entirely peaceful. Fighting still occurred in several regions as Portuguese loyalists resisted independence. But large-scale continental wars were avoided partly because Brazil retained its monarchy and much of its existing administrative structure. Even so, for Portugal, the loss was devastating. Brazil had become the empire's economic heart. Without it, Portugal's global position weakened dramatically. And yet the separation also reflected deeper historical realities. Brazil was simply too large, too populous, and too economically important to remain permanently subordinate once local elites developed political consciousness and administrative experience. The seeds of independence had been planted decades earlier through economic growth, regional identity, Enlightenment ideas, and the monarchy's own decision to elevate Brazil's status. Now those seeds had fully matured. Still, independence did not mean freedom for everyone. Far from it. Brazil remained deeply tied to slavery. In fact, independent Brazil continued importing enslaved Africans for decades after independence. Plantation agriculture, coffee production, and elite wealth all depended heavily on forced labor. The Atlantic slave trade remained central to the Brazilian economy well into the 19th century despite increasing international pressure against it. Britain especially pushed aggressively for abolition. By now, the British Empire dominated global naval power and increasingly presented itself as an opponent of the transatlantic slave trade. British warships patrolled Atlantic routes, attempting to suppress slave trafficking, though economic interests and political motives often complicated these efforts. Portugal itself gradually faced pressure to reduce participation in the trade. But economic dependency on slavery remained strong across both Portuguese Africa and Brazil. Meanwhile, back in Portugal, political instability intensified throughout the 19th century. The country struggled with constitutional conflicts, economic stagnation, royal disputes, military revolts, and competing visions for modernization. Liberal and conservative factions battled repeatedly over the future of the monarchy and state power. Without Brazil's wealth, Portugal's limitations became increasingly obvious. The once global empire was shrinking. Asian possessions had already declined dramatically. Brazil was gone. Only scattered territories in Africa, parts of India, Macau, East Timor, and a handful of Atlantic islands remained under Portuguese control. Yet instead of abandoning imperial ambition entirely, Portugal turned increasingly toward Africa. The 19th century was the age of the scramble for Africa, when European powers aggressively partitioned the continent among themselves. Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Italy all competed for territory, resources, and strategic influence. Portugal wanted to prove it still mattered. Portuguese leaders dreamed of connecting Angola on Africa's west coast to Mozambique on the east coast through a continuous belt of territory across Central Africa. Maps displaying these ambitions became known as the Pink Map because of the color used to mark Portuguese claims. But Portugal lacked the military and economic strength to impose such enormous territorial control effectively. And once again, Britain stood in the way. In 1890, the British government issued an ultimatum demanding Portugal withdraw from contested African regions that Britain wanted for its own imperial plans. Portugal, too weak to resist militarily, backed down. The humiliation shocked the Portuguese public. National anger exploded. Many blamed the monarchy for weakness and decline. Republican movements gained strength. The old empire that once connected continents now seemed trapped between fading memories and harsh realities. Then, in 1908, tragedy struck the royal family directly. King Carlos I and his heir were assassinated in Lisbon. 2 years later, in 1910, the Portuguese monarchy collapsed entirely. Portugal became a republic. The royal dynasty that had overseen centuries of exploration, conquest, trade, slavery, and empire was gone. But even after losing Brazil and abolishing the monarchy, Portugal still refused to let go of empire completely. In Africa, especially, colonial rule hardened during the 20th century. And the final collapse of the Portuguese Empire would become one of the longest and bloodiest endings to any European colonial system in modern history. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Portuguese Empire was no longer the vast global network it had once been. The days of Vasco da Gama, Albuquerque, and the spice fleets were long gone. Brazil, the empire's greatest colony, had become independent nearly a century earlier. Most Portuguese influence in Asia had faded under pressure from stronger European powers and rising Asian states. Yet Portugal still held onto significant territories. Angola and Mozambique in Africa remained enormous colonies rich in land and resources. Guinea-Bissau on the West African coast served as another colonial possession. Smaller territories such as Cape Verde, São Tomé and Príncipe, Goa in India, Macau in China, and East Timor in Southeast Asia also remained under Portuguese rule. To many European observers, Portugal appeared weak and outdated compared to Britain, France, or Germany. But to Portuguese nationalists, empire still represented prestige, identity, and historical purpose. The empire had become deeply woven into Portugal's understanding of itself. For centuries, Portuguese history books, political speeches, and national myths celebrated the Age of Discovery as proof that Portugal possessed a unique global destiny. Explorers were portrayed as heroic civilizers bringing Christianity, trade, and culture to distant lands. This imperial memory remained powerful even as reality changed around it. Inside Portugal itself, however, instability dominated the early decades of the Republic. The monarchy had fallen in 1910, but the new Republican government struggled constantly. Economic crises, military unrest, assassinations, strikes, and political fragmentation weakened the state. Governments rose and collapsed rapidly. Public confidence eroded. Then the First World War added further pressure. Portugal joined the war partly to defend its African colonies from German expansion and partly to support its long alliance with Britain. Portuguese troops fought in Europe and Africa, suffering heavy losses. The war strained the economy severely and deepened social unrest. The post-war years brought little stability. By the 1920s, many Portuguese citizens had grown disillusioned with parliamentary politics entirely. Then, in 1926, a military coup overthrew the republic. Out of the political chaos that followed emerged one of the most important figures in modern Portuguese history, Antônio de Oliveira Salazar. Originally an economics professor and deeply conservative Catholic, Salazar gradually consolidated power until he effectively ruled Portugal as dictator. His regime, known as the Estado Novo or New State, became authoritarian, nationalist, and fiercely committed to preserving empire. Salazar believed Portugal's colonies were not temporary possessions. He insisted they were inseparable parts of the nation itself. Under his ideology, Portugal was described as a pluricontinental nation, stretching across multiple continents as one unified civilization. Colonial territories were officially referred to not as colonies, but as overseas provinces. This language mattered politically. If Angola or Mozambique were provinces rather than colonies, then movements for independence could be portrayed not as anti-colonial struggles, but as attacks against Portuguese national unity itself. Salazar's regime tightly controlled political opposition, censored media, suppressed dissent, and relied heavily on secret police surveillance. Yet many conservative elites supported him because he promised order, stability, and preservation of national prestige. At first, Portugal's empire appeared relatively secure, but beneath the surface, major global changes were underway. The Second World War transformed international politics dramatically. European colonial powers emerged weakened economically and militarily. Anti-colonial nationalism spread rapidly across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. New global institutions like the United Nations increasingly challenged imperial systems. After 1945, empires everywhere began collapsing. India gained independence from Britain in 1947. Indonesia fought free from Dutch control. French colonies rebelled across Asia and Africa. One after another, European colonial empires unraveled. Portugal refused to follow the trend. Salazar remained stubbornly committed to maintaining overseas territories no matter the cost. And this refusal would eventually drag Portugal into some of the longest colonial wars of the 20th century. The first major blow came in India. Portugal had controlled Goa since the early 1500s. For over 4 centuries, it served as the center of Portuguese India. Churches, colonial buildings, and Catholic communities reflected centuries of Portuguese influence. But after Indian independence in 1947, pressure mounted for Portugal to surrender Goa and its remaining Indian territories. Salazar refused completely. He insisted Goa was Portuguese soil. Indian leaders attempted negotiations at first, but frustration grew. Anti-colonial activists organized protests and demonstrations. International opinion increasingly favored India's position. Finally, in December 1961, India launched a military operation to seize Goa, Daman, and Geo. Portuguese forces were hopelessly outnumbered. After brief resistance, the territories fell to India. For Portugal, the loss was psychologically devastating. Goa had been one of the oldest symbols of imperial history. Now it was gone. But the greatest struggles still lay ahead in Africa. By the 1960s, nationalist movements had emerged across Portuguese Africa. Inspired by anti-colonial victories elsewhere, African intellectuals, workers, students, and guerrilla leaders demanded independence. In Angola, several liberation movements formed, including the MPLA, FNLA, and UNITA. In Mozambique, Frelimo organized resistance against Portuguese rule. In Guinea-Bissau, the PAIC under Amilcar Cabral launched one of the most effective anti-colonial struggles in Africa. These movements differed ideologically and ethnically in many ways, but they shared one goal: ending Portuguese colonial rule. The Portuguese government responded with military force, and so began the colonial wars. Starting in 1961 and lasting more than a decade, Portugal fought simultaneous wars across multiple African territories. Hundreds of thousands of Portuguese soldiers were deployed overseas. Young men were conscripted for long tours in unfamiliar environments thousands of miles from home. The wars became brutal. Guerrilla fighters used ambushes, sabotage, and local knowledge to challenge Portuguese forces. Dense forests, remote terrain, and porous borders made conventional military victory extremely difficult. Portugal still possessed a relatively modern military and initially maintained significant battlefield advantages. Roads, towns, and strategic positions often remained under Portuguese control. But military success alone could not solve deeper political realities. The liberation movements continued growing, and the wars consumed enormous resources. Meanwhile, atrocities occurred on all sides. Portuguese forces conducted counterinsurgency campaigns involving forced relocations, torture, and harsh reprisals against suspected collaborators. Some liberation groups also committed executions and attacks against civilians. Entire communities became trapped inside cycles of violence. In Guinea-Bissau, especially, the PEG proved highly effective militarily and politically. Amilcar Cabral emphasized organization, education, and grassroots mobilization alongside armed struggle. By the early 1970s, large portions of the countryside had slipped beyond Portuguese control. International pressure increased steadily. Newly independent African nations supported liberation movements diplomatically and militarily. The Soviet Union, China, and Cuba provided assistance to various anti-colonial groups as Cold War rivalries intersected with decolonization struggles. Portugal grew increasingly isolated internationally. Even NATO allies quietly questioned the sustainability of endless colonial wars. Inside Portugal itself, the human and economic costs mounted relentlessly. Thousands of Portuguese soldiers died. Many more returned traumatized. Military spending drained the economy. Young people increasingly opposed conscription and dictatorship. And perhaps most dangerously for the regime, dissatisfaction spread inside the armed forces themselves. Many officers began realizing the wars could not truly be won. Among younger military officers especially, frustration deepened. They believed the dictatorship was sacrificing an entire generation to preserve an outdated empire that no longer reflected global reality. Then in 1974, everything changed suddenly. On April 25th, a group of military officers launched a coup in Lisbon. But unlike many coups, this one unfolded with remarkably little bloodshed. Citizens flooded into the streets, supporting the soldiers. People placed red carnations into rifle barrels and uniforms, giving the uprising its famous name. The Carnation Revolution. The dictatorship collapsed almost overnight. After nearly half a century, the Estado Novo regime was finished. And with it, the Portuguese Empire entered its final collapse. The new revolutionary government moved quickly toward decolonization. Negotiations began with African liberation movements. Portuguese troops started withdrawing. Independence came rapidly across the empire. Guinea-Bissau gained recognition first. Mozambique became independent in 1975 under Frelimo leadership. Angola followed the same year. Cape Verde and São Tomé and Príncipe also achieved independence peacefully. But independence did not automatically bring stability. In Angola and Mozambique especially, Cold War rivalries intensified existing tensions. Civil wars erupted almost immediately after Portuguese withdrawal. Foreign powers intervened heavily. Millions suffered through decades of conflict, displacement, famine, and violence. The end of empire created trauma not only in Africa, but also in Portugal itself. Hundreds of thousands of Portuguese settlers, known as retornados, fled former colonies and returned suddenly to Portugal. Many arrived with little more than what they could carry. Families lost homes, businesses, and entire lives built across generations overseas. Portugal struggled to absorb them economically and socially. The emotional collapse of empire proved difficult for many Portuguese citizens to process. For centuries, empire had shaped national identity. Now it was gone. Only a few remnants remained. Macau stayed under Portuguese administration until 1999, when it was transferred peacefully back to China. East Timor experienced a tragic path after Portugal's withdrawal. Indonesia invaded shortly after decolonization, leading to decades of occupation and suffering before East Timor finally achieved full independence in 2002. And with that, the Portuguese Empire truly ended. Nearly 6 centuries after the kingdom first emerged during the Reconquista, nearly 5 centuries after Vasco da Gama reached India, the first global maritime empire in history disappeared completely. Its legacy, however, remained everywhere. Portuguese language continued to unite millions across multiple continents. Brazil became the largest Portuguese-speaking nation in the world. Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau, São Tomé and Príncipe, and East Timor all retained Portuguese as an official language. Architectural styles, foods, religious traditions, music, and cultural practices shaped by Portuguese expansion survived across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. But so did darker legacies. The Portuguese Empire played a central role in building the Atlantic slave trade that forcibly transported millions of Africans across oceans into slavery. Colonial systems disrupted indigenous societies, fueled violence, extracted wealth, and imposed foreign rule across vast regions. Like all empires, Portugal's story contains both achievement and destruction. It connected distant worlds long before globalization became a modern concept. It reshaped trade routes, navigation, cartography, and cultural exchange. Yet also spread exploitation, inequality, forced labor, and imperial domination. And perhaps that contradiction is what makes the history of the Portuguese Empire so important. Because it was not simply a story about one small European kingdom becoming powerful. It was one of the first great chapters in the making of the modern, interconnected world itself. A world shaped by oceans, commerce, migration, religion, technology, conquest, resistance, and the constant collision between ambition and humanity. The ships that once left Lisbon searching for spices and gold ultimately changed global history forever. And even after the empire vanished, the world it helped create remained behind. When the Portuguese Empire finally disappeared at the end of the 20th century, there were no great victory celebrations in Lisbon. No final triunfal parade. No dramatic declaration that an age had ended. The collapse happened slowly, piece by piece, territory by territory, until one day the empire that had once stretched across 4 continents existed only in history books, old maps, ruined forts, fading churches, and the memories of those who had lived under it. And yet, even after the empire vanished politically, its fingerprints remained scattered across the globe. Because the Portuguese Empire did something few civilizations before it had ever attempted. It connected oceans. Long before airplanes, long before telegraphs, long before modern globalization, Portuguese ships linked Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Americas into a single interconnected network. Goods, languages, religions, crops, diseases, technologies, and ideas moved through those routes constantly. The empire was not merely about conquest. It became one of the earliest systems that tied distant parts of the world together in permanent and transformative ways. And that transformation changed history forever. The Portuguese were the first Europeans to establish sustained maritime connections with West Africa, India, Southeast Asia, China, Japan, and Brazil. Their navigators redrew the maps of the known world. Their cartographers expanded European geographical knowledge dramatically. Their sailors proved that global oceanic travel was possible on a regular basis. Before the Portuguese voyages, Europe's understanding of the wider world was fragmented and limited. Trade with Asia depended heavily on overland intermediaries. Information moved slowly. Entire regions existed more in rumor than direct knowledge. After Portuguese expansion, that changed permanently. Suddenly, spices from Indonesia could reach Lisbon by sea. Silver from the Americas could flow into Asian markets. African slaves could be transported to Brazilian plantations. Missionaries could travel from Europe to Japan. Chinese silk could appear in South American ports. The world became economically connected in ways that had never existed before. And once those connections formed, they never fully disappeared again. Even rival empires copied the Portuguese model. The Dutch, English, French, and Spanish all learned from Portuguese navigation, shipbuilding, cartography, colonial administration, and maritime strategy. In many ways, Portugal pioneered the blueprint for later European global empires. But the empire's story was never only about exploration or trade. It was also built on violence, and that truth cannot be separated from its legacy. The Portuguese Empire played a major role in creating and expanding the Atlantic slave trade. one of the most devastating systems in human history. Portuguese merchants, colonial officials, and private traders helped organize routes that forcibly transported millions of Africans across the Atlantic Ocean into slavery. Families were torn apart. Communities were destroyed. Entire regions of Africa experienced long-term destabilization through warfare, slave raiding, and demographic collapse. The wealth generated by enslaved labor fueled plantations, mining economies, and imperial expansion for centuries. Brazil alone received more enslaved Africans than any other country in the Atlantic slave system. Sugar plantations, gold mines, coffee farms, and urban economies all depended heavily on forced labor. The empire's prosperity became deeply tied to human suffering on a massive scale. And even after slavery formally ended, its consequences endured. Racial inequality, economic disparity, social exclusion, and structural discrimination continued shaping societies across the former Portuguese world long after abolition. The empire also transformed indigenous societies across multiple continents. In Brazil, native populations suffered catastrophic collapse due to disease, warfare, displacement, and forced labor following European contact. Entire cultures disappeared. Languages vanished. Territories were seized and reorganized under colonial systems. In parts of Africa and Asia, Portuguese influence disrupted existing political and economic structures, while also blending with local traditions in complex ways. Because the empire did not simply erase cultures. Often it mixed with them, and from those encounters, entirely new societies emerged. Brazil became one of the clearest examples of this cultural fusion. Portuguese settlers, indigenous peoples, enslaved Africans, and later immigrants from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia all contributed to a uniquely Brazilian identity shaped by centuries of colonial interaction. The same process happened elsewhere. In Angola and Mozambique, Portuguese language merged with African traditions and local realities. In Goa, Catholic churches stood beside Hindu temples while Indo-Portuguese culture developed distinct forms of architecture, cuisine, and music. In Macau, Chinese and Portuguese influences blended into one of the world's most unusual colonial societies. Even food tells the story of empire. Portuguese traders helped spread crops across continents in what historians sometimes call the Columbian Exchange. Chili peppers traveled from the Americas into Asia and became central to cuisines in India, Thailand, and China. Sweet potatoes spread into Africa and East Asia. New agricultural products reshaped diets globally. The empire also spread religion. Catholicism expanded deeply into Brazil, parts of Africa, Goa, East Timor, and beyond. Churches, monasteries, schools, and missionary institutions became embedded in colonial societies. Yet local communities often adapted Christianity to their own traditions, creating hybrid religious practices that reflected both European and indigenous influences. Language became perhaps the empire's most lasting connection. Today, Portuguese is spoken by more than 260 million people worldwide. Brazil alone became one of the world's largest nations, economically and culturally influential far beyond what Portugal itself could have imagined centuries earlier. Angola and Mozambique emerged as major African states with rapidly growing populations. Portuguese-speaking communities continued stretching across multiple continents long after the empire ended. In fact, the Portuguese language may ultimately outlive the memory of the empire itself. Modern Portugal also changed dramatically after decolonization. For centuries, empire had shaped Portuguese identity. Exploration and overseas expansion were central to national mythology. But after the Carnation Revolution and the collapse of colonial rule, Portugal increasingly redefined itself as a democratic European nation rather than an imperial power. The transition was not easy. The end of empire created political turmoil, economic difficulties, and emotional disorientation. Hundreds of thousands of retornados returned from former colonies carrying trauma, loss, and uncertainty. Portuguese society had to confront difficult questions about colonialism, dictatorship, race, and national identity. Over time, however, Portugal stabilized. Democracy consolidated after 1974. The country joined the European Economic Community, later the European Union, integrating more deeply into modern Europe. Economic modernization accelerated. Lisbon transformed into a contemporary European capital while still carrying traces of its imperial past in architecture, monuments, museums, and historical memory. But debates about empire never fully disappeared. In Portugal itself, historians, activists, politicians, and citizens continue discussing how the imperial past should be remembered. Some emphasize maritime achievements, cultural exchange, and global exploration. Others focus on slavery, colonial violence, racism, and exploitation. Both perspectives exist because both are part of the historical reality. Empires are rarely simple. They create wealth and suffering at the same time. They spread ideas while destroying others. They connect worlds while dominating them. The Portuguese Empire embodied all of those contradictions. And perhaps what makes its history especially remarkable is how unlikely it seemed from the beginning. Portugal was never one of Europe's largest kingdoms. Its population remained relatively small compared to France, Spain, or later Britain. It lacked the vast military manpower of larger continental states. Yet through navigation, strategy, persistence, and opportunity, it built the first truly global maritime empire in human history. For a moment in time, Portuguese ships appeared almost everywhere. From the coast of Brazil to the ports of India, from African fortresses to Japanese harbors, from Atlantic islands to Chinese enclaves. The empire became a bridge between worlds that previously barely knew each other existed. And although the empire itself eventually collapsed, the global connections it helped create continued expanding long after Portuguese power faded. Modern globalization, international trade networks, cultural exchange across oceans, and even some modern migration patterns can trace part of their origins back to those early voyages launched from Lisbon centuries ago. That does not excuse the violence of empire, but it does explain why its history matters. Because the story of the Portuguese Empire is ultimately not only the story of Portugal. It is the story of how the modern interconnected world began taking shape. A world where continents became tied together economically and culturally. A world transformed by maritime exploration. A world shaped by trade, migration, colonization, religion, resistance, technology, ambition, greed, and survival. The empire rose from a small Atlantic kingdom, fighting for independence on the edge of medieval Europe. It expanded across oceans no European kingdom had crossed before. It created fortunes and destroyed lives. It spread languages and chains. It carried both missionaries and slave traders. It built cities, forts, churches, and trade routes. And after nearly 6 centuries, it disappeared. But the echoes of that empire still remain in languages spoken by millions, in cities built along old colonial routes, in music, religion, food, architecture, surnames, political borders, and collective memory across 4 continents. The empire ended. The world it helped shape did not.